Now I've been to some awkward family gatherings in my life, including the time my cousin tried to deep fry a turkey indoors and nearly turned his kitchen into a bonfire. But nothing quite prepares a man for standing at the back of his father-in-law's funeral while his wife blocks the seat next to her with a handbag that costs more than his truck. That's how I spent the morning Glenn Darby was laid to rest. Standing under a Christmas tree at the back of a chapel that smelled like pine needles and regret. 55 filled chairs and the 56th was mine, or it used to be, back when being her husband meant something more than a formality. But that day it meant nothing. She waved me off like a valet and told me to stand in the back. Said the family section was full. I should have known then. A woman who picks the seating chart at her father's funeral like she's hosting a gala isn't grieving. She's managing optics. And she put on a show. Told stories about how Glenn rescued animals and mentored young entrepreneurs. Spoke about his legacy like she wasn't already calculating the numbers in her head. Never once mentioned the man who drove him to every doctor's appointment on Sundays or installed the handrails in his bathroom or sat through the war stories even after they started looping like a broken tape. That man was me. But I wasn't in the script. 15 minutes of eulogy and not a whisper of my name. But I saw it. Peeking out of her designer clutch was a legal document with my name in bold letters. My gut knew what it was even before she slid it across the kitchen table 2 days later with that pen she only used for monogram thank you notes. "I'm choosing myself," she said like it was a TED Talk. Said she'd been thinking about it for a while. Said the timing felt right. Right after the memorial, before the will was even cold. I told her I understood. And I did. See, there's a special kind of betrayal that doesn't come with yelling or slammed doors or lipstick stains. Comes quietly. With perfectly timed smiles and legal documents and the kind of precision only a heart trained in self-interest can master. She thought she was cutting ties clean. But the man she underestimated was the same one her father trusted with everything that mattered. And he'd left me a gift far bigger than she could ever imagine. She just didn't know it yet. 3 days after the funeral, I walked into Hartwell and Associates dressed in my Sunday suit. The one that made me look like I was going to ask for a loan instead of inherit a fortune. I was invited to the reading of Glenn Darby's will, which surprised me more than the complimentary coffee they served in the small conference room where dreams went to either die or get reborn. Karina didn't look at me. Not even a sideways glance. She sat at the head of the table like Cleopatra in litigation mode. Black suit crisp as fresh dollar bills and a face that could have frozen a volcano. Everyone expected the same thing. 1 million to the charities. 50,000 to the help. The rest. Every investment, every property, every dollar. To go to the grieving daughter who gave the world that Oscar-worthy funeral performance. But Glenn Darby wasn't interested in playing by the script. To my beloved daughter Karina, the lawyer read, I leave the sum of $1 million. You could hear the confusion hit the room like a truck full of marbles on a marble floor. The rest of the estate, all 249 million of it, he left to me. Now I'm not the kind of man who thinks about money more than he has to, but I'll tell you something. There's a very specific shade of red that creeps into a woman's face when her entire life plan just got rerouted through her ex-husband. Karina wore it well. She didn't speak. Not at first. Just sat there gripping the table like she was trying to keep the world from spinning out from under her. There must be some mistake, she finally whispered. There is no mistake, the lawyer said gently. Your father was very specific. And oh, he was. Because later that afternoon I found myself face to face with the reason why Glenn had handed me the keys to his kingdom. A letter, not typed, not notarized. Just plain ink on plain paper from a man who knew the game his daughter was playing better than she did. Wendell, he wrote. If you're hearing this, then my daughter has probably already tried to destroy you. He wasn't wrong. The letter went on to explain that 40% of my inheritance was conditional. I had to stay divorced for 18 months. No reconciliation. No second chances. No coming back from the grave with a weak apology and a crocodile tear. She only knew how to feed you crumbs, he wrote. Don't let her leash you again. Now here's the thing, you don't leave a letter like that unless you've watched a man suffer. Unless you've seen him sit through dinner after dinner wondering why his wife is looking at her phone instead of him. Unless you've heard him say, I'm fine. So many times it starts to sound like a prayer. And Glenn heard it. which is why he made sure she couldn't sweet-talk her way back into the castle after tossing the loyal knight into the moat. The next week she showed up at my job like a thunderstorm in heels, slammed a folder on my desk and told me I didn't deserve a penny. "You fix potholes and clean gutters," she said. "You don't inherit empires." And maybe she was right. Maybe I wasn't born into silk sheets and stock options. But her father knew the difference between a man who builds and a woman who schemes. He saw it in every bowl of soup, every trip to the VA, every handshake that came without expectation. And now she was watching her future walk away in steel-toed boots and a city ID badge. She offered me $5 million to walk away from everything. I said no, because some things are more valuable than money, like freedom, like dignity, like watching the woman who once told you to stand in the back corner learn that sometimes the best man really does finish first. It started on a Sunday, which used to be our day for slow breakfasts and long walks and half-hearted attempts to weed the backyard before quitting early and calling it a success. These days Sunday meant I grilled steaks at my cousin Jake's place and drank just enough beer to remember what peace felt like before I married ambition in high heels. That's where she found me. Porch swaying slow breeze rustling the trees and a paper plate of ribs on my lap. When Karina pulled up in the luxury car she once claimed was a company bonus, but was really just a trophy from playing house with a man she never respected. No folder this time, no pen, just a photo in her hand. Our wedding day, the string lights, the backyard, that smile I used to think was love but now knew was rehearsal. "We were good once," she said like she was narrating a rom-com montage. I didn't say a word, just studied the image. I remembered that day, the cheap champagne, the too-tight collar, the way she looked at me like I was a project she'd just finished assembling. Felt real back then, but feelings lie. "I want us to try again," she said. And there it was, the second chance shuffle. The move every manipulator pulls when the first plan fails. She talked about babies and breakfast dates and how the money had changed everything. But what she really meant was the money had changed her standing, and she wanted it back. I told her about the clause, the part where reconciling with her would send 40% of the inheritance straight to a dog sanctuary. Her face dropped like a power line in an ice storm. "You're joking. Your father wasn't." She blinked like she'd just realized the chessboard had been flipped upside down. "That's insane." "Is it? Because here you are, right on cue, trying to get me back for the money." She started with the usual lines. "I love you. We were good together. People change." But each word was a recycled script and I'd heard the blooper reel already. "If you really love me," I said, "walk away. Let me go. Leave me alone." She couldn't, because love wasn't what she wanted. Control was. Karina didn't marry me for romance. She married me for symmetry. A husband who wouldn't embarrass her in public or challenge her in private. Someone to stand beside her in photos and disappear behind her in boardrooms. She picked me like a handbag, classic, neutral, dependable. But now the handbag was holding the keys to the kingdom and she didn't know how to ask for them back without sounding like a thief. "You'll regret this," she said before she left. I nodded. Maybe I would. But I'd rather regret walking away from a mistake than spend the rest of my life apologizing for being loyal to one. That night Jake sat beside me and asked what came next. "Now we wait," I said. 18 months. "You think she'll stop?" "Nope." And I was right. Because 2 weeks later an envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address. Just a single sheet of paper. Typed, "There are things you don't know, Wendell. Be careful who you trust with Glenn's secrets." Now I'd seen enough movies to know that when a warning comes in courier font and paranoia ink, it means the past just woke up from its nap. I didn't know who sent it, but I knew where to start looking. Glenn's house. My house now. Locked up tight and quiet as a mausoleum. But inside, buried under dust and leather and that smell of old books and older secrets, was something Glenn wanted me to find. Because dead men don't write warnings. But they sure do leave breadcrumbs. The letter had said to look in the pantry, third shelf behind the cereal boxes, and I swear I've never moved a box of Raisin Bran with more fear and curiosity in my life because Glenn wasn't the type to exaggerate unless he was talking about how he used to arm wrestle Marines with one hand while rebuilding carburetors with the other. What I found was a plain blue folder like something from a third-grade science project, except this one didn't contain a poorly glued volcano. It contained pharmacy receipts for medications Glenn was never prescribed, bank statements with unusual cash withdrawals, and a private investigator's report that could have knocked the wind out of a hurricane. And at the heart of it all was Karina. The daughter who brought tea instead of kindness, who made soup when she needed something signed, who showed up more in the last 6 weeks of his life than the last 6 years. According to the PI report, she was in debt, trying to cover bad investments and pay off a credit card with someone else's last name on the bill, and right after Glenn started changing the terms of his will, her visits increased, and so did his symptoms. Chest pain, shortness of breath, dizziness. Always after she stopped by with one of her signature homemade meals. But it was the handwritten letter tucked behind all those documents that burned the deepest into my memory. "I suspect my daughter is trying to eliminate me," Glenn wrote. "She's been visiting more frequently, always bringing food, always urging me to rest. I've had episodes every time she comes over, and I no longer believe it's coincidence. I've changed my will to reflect the only person who's treated me like family these last few years. Wendell deserves better than this." It was dated 3 weeks before he died. I took photos of everything, put it all back exactly where I found it, and sat on the floor of his study until the sun started bleeding through the blinds, trying to make sense of a world that had flipped itself inside out. Karina hadn't just filed for divorce 2 days after burying her father. She'd started playing chess with his life before the funeral hymn was even chosen. That evening she called, like she had a sensor in her bloodstream that detected shifts in control. "You weren't supposed to see that," she said right out of the gate, like this was some movie and I just discovered the final twist. "See what?" "Oh, come on, Wendell, don't play stupid, it doesn't suit you." She tried to spin it. Said Glenn was paranoid, delusional near the end, claimed he saw shadows where there were none. Said that if I dared to use those documents against her, I'd only be proving I was the manipulative one, the one who poisoned him emotionally with dependency. But what she didn't know is that the harder you press a loyal man, the more likely he is to stop being polite and start being precise. The next day I came back to the house and the locks had been changed. The property manager swore no one had ordered it, which meant Karina had found a way in, or had never left. By that point I'd stopped being surprised. I called the police, asked for Glenn's death certificate. Cause of passing listed as myocardial infarction. Heart attack. No autopsy per family request. Which family, I asked. Karina's request, they said. Of course. The only person who didn't want questions was the one with all the answers. I spent that night reading medical journals and poison logs like I was prepping for a very dark science fair, and learned that dozens of toxins could mimic cardiac events if administered properly. Subtle, silent, fatal. And Glenn had complained about feeling ill after her visits. So either the man was a hypochondriac with impeccable timing, or he knew he was being hunted. I went back to the house again. The door was wide open. The study was gutted. The safe behind the bookshelf was missing. So was the computer. And every folder except one lone sticky note on the floor. It read, "Tell Wendell the truth." My phone rang while I was still holding that note like it had weight. Karina again. "You found it, didn't you?" "Found what?" "Don't act coy, Wendell. I know where you've been and what you've touched. And if you think those little notes are enough to turn this into a true crime podcast, you're sadly mistaken." She was unraveling. Not because I had found the truth, but because she knew now that I believed it. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in Glenn's empty chair drinking old scotch and realizing that freedom wasn't just the absence of chains. It was knowing the woman who once said she loved you would rather bury her father's truth than let go of the lie she lived in. I thought the worst of it was over, but that was just the comfort talking. The kind of comfort that comes from ignorance, because the truth is when a liar loses control, they don't retreat, they retaliate, and Karina came back with a vengeance sharper than the divorce papers she slid across our kitchen table. She accused me, flat out, of poisoning her father. Said I was the last one to see him alive, the one who made him soup the night he died, and wasn't that suspicious, Wendell? How convenient that you just happened to be there when his heart gave out. The woman who lied to my face for 8 years now wanted the world to believe I'd staged a long con just to steal her father's money. And the worst part, she had the gall to say it like she was worried about justice. But all I saw in her eyes was strategy. She said I was a parasite, that Glenn only kept me around to make it look like she had chosen a decent husband. And maybe that would have worked if not for one little wrinkle. The clause. The 40% leash Glenn wrapped around my neck from the grave. The clause that said if I ever reconciled with her, the money would go to a dog sanctuary. Because Glenn knew her, knew she'd try this, knew she'd twist the narrative. He'd watched her feed me crumbs and watched me smile and nod like that was a meal. He knew if she couldn't win the inheritance back with charm, she'd try to take it back with scandal. But I wasn't alone anymore. I hired a lawyer. Not some suit from a skyscraper, but a former prosecutor named Sarah Chun, who looked like she'd seen every lie the world had to offer and learned to stop flinching. She read the documents I gave her, took one look at Karina's attempts to access Glenn's accounts, and said the words that lit a fire in my chest. We build a case. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about telling the truth louder than she could lie. And it started with questions. Why had Glenn changed his will so abruptly? Why had Karina visited him so often near the end? Why had she refused an autopsy and insisted on a closed casket? Why did she lie about where she was the night before he died? We didn't have all the answers, but we had enough to cast a long shadow, and Karina could feel it, because she showed up again, not with threats this time, but with tears. Sat on my porch holding a photograph of our wedding like it was proof of something other than a well-executed illusion. She said she missed me, said she made mistakes, said we could fix it, but what she meant was, she was losing control. She didn't want me. She wanted the version of me who didn't ask questions, who stayed quiet while she played ambitious daughter by day and distant wife by night. You'll change your mind, she said as she stood to leave, and maybe she believed that, because that's what manipulators believe, that if they cry enough and wait long enough the old version of you will come crawling back. But the old me was gone, buried under years of silence and sacrifice, and that moment at the funeral when she smiled like I was an uninvited guest at my own life. So I told her what she never thought she'd hear. I'll take that risk, and I watched her walk away without looking back. But I knew she wasn't done, because Karina doesn't lose. She reloads, and sure enough, the next day an unmarked envelope landed in my mailbox. Inside was a typed message that made my blood run cold. There are things you don't know, Wendell. Be careful who you trust with Glenn's secrets. I already knew the war had started, but now it was clear. I wasn't the only one fighting. Someone else had been watching, and they were ready to talk. The envelope had rattled me more than I wanted to admit, not because it said anything I hadn't already suspected, but because it came from someone who clearly knew things they shouldn't, and when your life's already unraveling thread by thread, it doesn't take much to snap the whole spool loose. So when the knock came on my door the next evening just past sundown, I didn't hesitate to answer. She was older, late 50s, maybe, sharp eyes tucked behind a mess of gray curls, and a coat that looked like it had seen better winters. You don't know me, she said, but I knew your father-in-law. I didn't say anything, just stepped aside and let her in. She sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Karina had once offered me divorce papers like they were breakfast options, and laid a manila envelope on the surface like it weighed more than it should have. My name's Evelyn Grant. I was Glenn's assistant for 9 years. I left the firm 6 months before he passed. Thought I'd gotten out clean. But I've been carrying something around, and I think you need to see it. I opened the envelope, and inside were emails printed out and annotated with pen like someone had been building a case the old-fashioned way. Long threads between Glenn and his estate lawyer, timestamps from security footage, access logs from his cloud account, even flagged entries in Karina's calendar showing visits that coincided with his medical episodes. Glenn started keeping a file on her after his third incident, she said. He didn't want to believe it. She was his only child. But he wasn't blind. He saw her ambition, saw what she was becoming. I flipped through the pages, and with every turn I saw the same pattern. She'd visit. He'd get sick. He'd recover. And then she'd visit again. It was a cycle with a rhythm too perfect to be coincidence. She knew about his medication. Evelyn continued. Knew how much was too much. Knew when to bring it up and when to pretend it was her idea to switch brands. But why? I asked. She was already his heir. Not enough, Evelyn said. Karina didn't just want the money. She wanted control. She wanted to cut out anything that didn't fit her version of legacy. And that included you. She handed me one final paper. A scanned copy of a handwritten letter from Glenn that hadn't been in the pantry folder. It was dated 4 days before his death. If anything happens to me and Wendell is blamed, know this, he's innocent. He was the only one who ever looked me in the eye without wanting something in return. I didn't realize my hands were shaking until I saw the letter tremble. Evelyn stood and pulled her coat tight around her shoulders. I stayed silent too long, she said. But your wife isn't going to stop, and you need to be ready when she comes for more than your money. I thanked her, but she just nodded and walked out into the dark like she was used to exits that didn't require applause. That night I laid the new evidence beside the old and watched it all form a picture I didn't want to admit had been there the whole time. Karina had been dismantling her father's legacy piece by piece, and I had been the final loose nail she couldn't hammer out. The next morning I got a call from Sarah Chun. "We've got what we need," she said. "This isn't just a contested will anymore. This is attempted fraud. Possibly something worse." "You mean attempted murder?" There was a long pause. "I mean, we don't say those words until we can prove them, but I'd already said them. Because sometimes truth shows up dressed like a stranger. And all you can do is listen." The court date came faster than expected, or maybe it just felt that way because when you're watching the person you once loved try to rewrite history with a courtroom full of strangers, time has a funny way of turning minutes into migraines. Karina walked in like she was headlining a press conference. Black blazer sharp enough to slice concrete, and the same empty smile she wore at her father's funeral, as if grief was just another performance she'd rehearsed in the mirror with mascara and menace. She sat across from me and didn't blink once. We weren't there for divorce. We weren't there for custody. We were there because she had filed a formal motion to contest Glenn's will on grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity, which is a fancy way of saying she was accusing me of tricking a dying man into leaving his fortune to a janitor in a rented suit. But what she didn't know was that Sarah Chun had built a case so solid it could hold up a bridge, and we'd stacked every piece of it on the table like a poker player with a royal flush. Emails, receipts, security footage, phone records, statements from Evelyn, and even a retired pharmacist who confirmed that the medication found in Glenn's system wasn't on any official prescription list. And then we dropped the blue folder. That quiet little time bomb. The one Glenn had hidden behind cereal boxes like he knew the end would come, not with a bang but a whisper. Her face didn't change much. She was trained for that. But her lawyer shifted in his seat like the floor had suddenly gone soft. Sarah stood calmly and read the handwritten note aloud. "If anything happens to me and Wendell is blamed, know this, he's innocent. He was the only one who ever looked me in the eye without wanting something in return." The courtroom went silent. Not dramatic silence. Not the kind you see in movies. Just the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own heartbeat and realize it's still ticking in spite of everything. The judge reviewed the materials quietly, then asked Karina's attorney if he wished to continue pursuing the motion. There was a pause. A long one. And then he folded his hands and said, "No, Your Honor, we withdraw the motion." Just like that. 4 months of threats and tension and late-night phone calls and legal fees and whispered warnings. Gone. She didn't look at me. She didn't apologize. She didn't cry. She just stood, slowly gathered her things, and walked out of the courtroom like someone who had finally realized the only thing left to take was the exit. Afterwards, Sarah and I stood outside on the courthouse steps under a sky that didn't care about any of it. Not the lies, not the inheritance, not the pain. "You did good, Wendell," she said. "You kept your head when she wanted you to lose it." I nodded. Didn't say much. Just thought about Glenn. About his stubborn, quiet way of seeing people for who they really were, not who they pretended to be. I thought about that day in the back corner of the funeral when I stood beside a Christmas tree while she gave a eulogy about a man I loved like a father but apparently never belonged to by blood. And I realized something. She was right. I wasn't family. I was more. Because you don't choose family. But Glenn chose me. And that choice meant something. I still live in the house. I still drive the same truck. I still fix things because it's what I know how to do. But now I fix them for me. Not to be noticed. Not to be accepted. Just because it's who I am. And every so often I walk past that pantry. 3rd shelf behind the cereal. And I nod at the spot where Glenn hid his last truth. Because it reminds me that even in a world full of liars and lawyers and long cons, sometimes the good guy really does win. Not because he fought harder, but because he stood still long enough for the truth to catch up.